This is Lesson 23-4, The Responsive National State, 1871 to 1914. What general domestic trends emerged after 1871? College Board Topic 6.8 is called 19th Century Social Reform. Explain the various movements and calls for social reform that resulted from intellectual developments from 1815 to 1914. Political movements and social organizations responded to problems of industrialization. Mass-based political parties emerged as sophisticated vehicles for social, economic, and political reform. Workers established labor unions and movements promoting social and economic reforms that also developed into political parties. College Board Topic 7.2, Nationalism. Explain how the development and spread of nationalism affected Europe from 1815 to 1914. Nationalists encouraged loyalty to the nation in a variety of ways, including romantic idealism, liberal reform, political unification, racialism with a concomitant anti-Semitism, and chauvinism justifying national aggrandizement. We've seen that before. While during the 19th century Western European Jews became more socially and politically acculturated, Zionism, a form of Jewish nationalism, developed late in the century as a response to growing anti-Semitism throughout Europe. A new generation of conservative leaders, including Napoleon III, Cavour, and Bismarck, used popular nationalism to create or strengthen the state. And the creation of the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary, which recognized the political power of the largest ethnic minority, was an attempt to stabilize the state by reconfiguring national unity. College Board Topic 7.3, National Unification and Diplomatic Tensions. Explain the factors that resulted in Italian unification and German unification. Cavour's diplomatic strategies, combined with the popular Garibaldi's military campaigns, led to the unification of Italy. Bismarck used realpolitik, employing diplomacy, industrialized warfare, weaponry, and the manipulation of democratic mechanisms to unify Germany. Places: France, Great Britain, Ireland, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire from 1871 to 1914. Key concepts of the responsive national state: the Kulturkampf, state-run welfare programs, the Social Democratic Party, the SPD, the Paris Commune, and the Dreyfus Affair. Key people of the responsive national state: Adolphe Thiers, Theodor Herzl, David Lloyd George, Count Otto von Bismarck, and Alfred Dreyfus. European politics changed during this time. The nation-state was universal throughout Europe. Mass politics emerged. Popular loyalty to the nation emerged. Traditional elites had to make adjustments to maintain power. There were new kinds of leaders out there. There were new constitutions. They specified universal male suffrage. All men could at least vote for the lower houses of these assemblies. New political parties emerged during this time. They represented a broader array of interests than before. They won and lost hard-fought election campaigns. Their politicians discovered a newfound loyalty to their constituents. Powerful government bureaucracies emerged, and these managed growing populations. They managed modern economies, and they took on more social responsibilities such as free education, welfare, and public health. Conservatives and moderates made significant discoveries about how national loyalty works. They found that you could control it and increase it with benefits. And they found that you could also increase it with foreign policy. Even the most hardened, most skeptical, most volatile socialist will rally around the flag when there's an international crisis. And when your country seizes another country, it's a source of national pride for you. You can use foreign policy to manipulate the masses. You can unite people behind militarism and imperialism. You can distract the people from what you are doing domestically. You can do it even if it involves policies, methods, and values abroad that the people would never tolerate at home. The people would storm your gates if you tried these things at home, But the exact same thing over there to those people is somehow, some way, not the same thing. The German Empire. Some things to remember. As we know, the German Empire was founded in 1871. Otto von Bismarck was the chancellor until 1890. Germany had a constitution. Prussia's assembly, the Landtag, had become Germany's Reichstag. It was popularly elected, and there were now political parties. Bismarck and the Reichstag. Bismarck repeatedly ignored the wishes of the majority in the Reichstag. That was his right under the Constitution, but he wanted their support if he could get it, and he wanted to support the Reichstag if he could give his support. His favorite party was the National Liberals. They had supported him ever since 1866, and they also backed his Kulturkampf campaign. So what was this Kulturkampf? The Kulturkampf was Bismarck's attack on the Catholic Church, and this began immediately in 1871. In 1870, the First Vatican Council in Rome clearly defined the conditions under which papal infallibility took place. And by the way, papal infallibility is highly misunderstood. It's not a situation in which the Pope walks around perpetually 24/7 being infallible. Papal infallibility is actually an event. It takes place under very specific conditions, and it is extraordinarily rare. Bismarck was a Prussian, a Junker, and a landowning Protestant. His problem wasn't with the dogma of infallibility as such. His concern was that the millions of Catholic Germans would give more loyalty and more credence to Rome than to Germany. And he wanted their loyalty to be to Germany and Germany alone. The problem with Otto von Bismarck's Kulturkampf was this. The Catholics responded by forming their own political party, the Catholic Center Party. And many Protestants joined that party as well. And this included many Protestants from Bismarck's own Junker class. The reason was they saw Bismarck's Kulturkampf as a campaign not just against the Catholic Church, but against all religious freedom. The Catholic Center Party managed to block every anti-Catholic law that Bismarck tried to pass. And Bismarck conducted his Kulturkampf for 8 years and got nowhere. And then in 1878, Bismarck abandoned the Kulturkampf entirely. Why? Bismarck realized that there was a much more dangerous enemy to national loyalty out there than Rome. And he needed to get both of the following on his side in order to compete with this other enemy. He needed the conservative Protestant land-owning East Prussians, and he needed the Catholic farmers of southern and western Germany. And what do these two groups have in common? Both liked protectionism. Protectionism is the practice of having high tariffs to protect domestic industries from foreign competition. And both groups were getting squeezed by imports of cheap grain. Bismarck revoked Germany's free trade policy. He enacted high tariffs on grain imports, and he won over the Catholic Center and the conservative Protestants. He also alienated everyone else in Europe. In the 1880s and 1890s, other countries retaliated with their own tariffs. Protectionism is just another form of nationalism. You can blame other countries for your economic problems. And new tariffs led to two things: name-calling and trade wars. And finally, what was this new enemy that had Bismarck so worried? It was Marxist ideology. The scariest political party out there was the SPD, the German Social Democratic Party. They were Marxist, they were working class, they had the least amount of loyalty to the state. They believed in a guy, Karl Marx, who said that nations were just an artificial construct of the capitalist bourgeoisie, and soon there would be a violent worldwide workers' revolution, and when that violent revolution came, there wouldn't be a need for any more countries, and the whole world would just be one harmonious workers' paradise. Here is a picture of the SPD. How do you win these people over? Well, the obvious answer in Bismarck's mind was this. In 1878, Bismarck pushed back through lots of anti-socialist laws. He banned the SPD. He used his new alliance of the Catholics and the Protestants, and the SPD went underground. And the SPD still retained a lot of influence. Banning the SPD had very limited effect. Bismarck's thought process went like this. I need to make the German state compete successfully with the SPD for the loyalty of the working class. I can't just outlaw the SPD. When I do that, I'm making their point for them. The Marxist message to the working class was, the bourgeoisie run Germany. The bourgeoisie don't care about you. They just want to exploit you. The German state is not your friend. How could the German state counter, disrupt, and diffuse this message? The answer? State-run social welfare programs. I am going to blindside these Marxists with something that their ideology can't even conceive. The German state is going to provide for the economic welfare of its workers. If we can show the working class that the government values their hard work and cares about them as people, we might just win them over. In 1883, Social Security laws started getting passed. Things like national health insurance, accident insurance, retirement benefits, paid for with mandatory wage contributions, mandatory employer contributions, and government grants. These innovations had never happened before in human history, all because the state needed to compete with Marxist ideology. We tend to think that Karl Marx was a complete failure, and it's true that even his successes were eventual failures. It's true that he never saw the workers' paradise he envisioned. But he actually got a lot further than we normally think. He forced governments all over the world to compete with his ideology for the hearts and minds of their proletariats. In 1890, Wilhelm II became the German emperor. He forced Bismarck out of power. He legalized the SPD. He had new laws passed to help workers. In spite of Bismarck's efforts, the SPD grew. In 1912, it was the largest party in the Reichstag. However, Bismarck and Wilhelm I had forced the SPD to become much less radical and soften its message. It also became more patriotic. It gave up on revolution, and it pushed instead for more social and political reforms. France, after the Franco-Prussian War. Paris and the provinces of France had always been at odds with each other, as we know. Paris was urban, radical, and republican. Provinces were rural, conservative, and monarchist. The disastrous Battle of Sedan took place in September 1870. Emperor Napoleon III himself was captured. A group of Republican patriot politicians in Paris declared the Third French Republic. They swore to defend Paris from the Prussians, but they surrendered after a few weeks in January 1871, and that was the end of the Franco-Prussian War. Bismarck allowed new elections to the National Assembly in France. The winners were going to have to deal with the victorious Prussians. The people of France rejected the Parisian Republican candidates. Instead, they elected a large majority of conservative monarchists to the National Assembly. That was simply not acceptable to these Parisian Republicans. Hence, the Paris Commune, March 1871. The Paris Commune had been the official municipal government of Paris, as we learned long ago. These radical Parisian Republicans decided that they were going to run Paris separately from the rest of France, and they had 250,000 reserve troops at their disposal. The Paris Commune had all of these radical reforms, including workplace reform, separation of church and state, press censorship, and radical feminism. The new leader of the French National Assembly was an old statesman named Adolphe Thiers. He was a moderate monarchist. The Prussian army was surrounding Paris, and the Prussian army simply got out of the way and let the defeated French army assume their positions around the city, and then Adolphe Thiers had the French army brutally crush the Paris Commune. With the Prussians breathing down his back, he had no choice. When it was all over, as many as 25,000 people were dead. Ironically, this event made France more stable and more unified than before. Now, Adolphe Thiers had to negotiate peace with the victors. The Germans were very harsh with France. Field Marshal Helmut von Moltke actually met Thiers at the hotel for the negotiations and told him something like, "You're lucky you're dealing with Bismarck. If it was me, I'd occupy France for 30 years, and there wouldn't be a France at the end of it." Bismarck's demands were 8 billion francs, which France couldn't afford, and the territory of Alsace. After some extremely tense and stressful negotiation, Thiers got Bismarck down to 5 million francs, and that was in exchange for parts of Lorraine. At one point, Adolphe Thiers couldn't take the pressure anymore. He broke down and cried right there at the negotiation table. Bismarck put his overcoat around him and led him to a sofa, and he said, "Oh, my poor Monsieur Thiers, there is no one but you and I who really love France." The monarchists were in control of the National Assembly. They currently had a republic, but they wanted a constitutional monarchy. But they couldn't agree on a fitting king. Should they get a Bourbon or an Orleans or a Bonaparte? There were descendants of all three of these families living in exile in England. The National Assembly finally settled on Henri, Count of Chambord. He was a Bourbon. He had the best claim. He was willing, if not eager, to assume the throne as King Henry V. But then he insisted on getting rid of the tricolor French flag and replacing it with his family's fleur-de-lis on a field of white flag. Now the French government was faced with a choice. What do we want our flag to say to us and to the world about who we are and what we stand for? Do we stand for liberty, equality, and fraternity? Or do we stand for aristocracy, elitism, and oppression? So they told Henri, "Sorry, the fleur-de-lis is a deal breaker." And Henri told them to have a nice day, and he walked away from the French throne. You can't form a constitutional monarchy if you can't find a monarch. So the French government was stuck with the Third Republic. They didn't want a republic, but that was what they had. The National Assembly couldn't think of a better president than Adolphe Thiers. He had taken on Bismarck and survived. He was a monarchist, but not too much of a monarchist for the liberal Republicans. He was also sufficiently harsh with that Paris Commune, so he could run a republic in a way that made the conservatives happy. As a monarchist, Adolphe Thiers became president of a republic that he really didn't want. But he took office in August of 1871 anyway. And he told the National Assembly, "Hey, this is the type of government that divides us the least." He remained president for 3 years. He got the Germans to remove their occupational forces 2 years early. He established a context in which future moderate Republicans could thrive for the next several years, 1879 to 1886. What is a moderate Republican? When we say Republican, we don't mean Donald Trump or George Bush. It's more fundamental than that. A Republican, in our historical context, is someone who believes that the country is best served by a republic rather than by a constitutional monarchy. A moderate Republican is also a Republican who believes in cautious, pragmatic, political and social improvement rather than abrupt, ideologically driven change. Examples of moderate Republican improvements would be expanded public schools, compulsory education for boys and girls. These things are critical for nation building. The infamous Dreyfus Affair. This is so significant that I have a separate lesson just on the Dreyfus Affair. This was a scandal between 1894 and 1899 that split French society in two. Over 500 books have been written about it in the last 120 years. It's one of the most famous miscarriages of justice in modern history. It's a classic study of miscarriage in general. Its ramifications are still very much with us today. Who was Alfred Dreyfus? In 1894, he was a captain in the statistical section, otherwise known as counterintelligence, of the Ministry of War of France. He was an artillery expert, he was Jewish, and somebody was leaking secret military documents to the Germans. The finger was pointed at him, and he was indicted, tried, and unanimously convicted and sentenced to life in prison. He spent over 4 years in the notorious prison at Devil's Island off the coast of French Guiana. All of this happened with no evidence at all. Dreyfus was eventually retried in 1899 after a monumental effort on the parts of many heroic people whose names we will find out. He was convicted again, but this time the president of France offered him an official pardon, which he hesitantly accepted. Dreyfus was freed, and in 1906, the French Supreme Court overturned his conviction completely. Dreyfus was reinstated back into the army as a major. Ramifications of the Dreyfus Affair. This affair consumed all aspects of French life for years, especially in public opinion, especially in the press. It undermined the stability of the Third Republic, and French society was deeply divided. You had the Dreyfusards. These were pro-Republican and anti-clerical. And you had the anti-Dreyfusards, pro-army, anti-Semitic, mostly Catholic. It exposed deep French anti-Semitism to the world, in society, in the army. And it exposed French government corruption to the world. It sparked a new nationalist movement, Zionism. Jewish Austrian journalist Theodor Herzl followed the entire Dreyfus Affair, and he became convinced that the only way Jews could avoid anti-Semitism was to have their own nation. Theodor Herzl then founded the Zionist movement, and the Zionist movement eventually made the state of Israel possible in Palestine. Today, the Arab-Israeli conflict has no end in sight. La laïcité, secularism, the legal separation of church and state, was another result. And this was made into law in 1905. And it is a fundamental part of the French Constitution. And it's a direct result of the Dreyfus Affair. Under la laïcité, you are allowed no public displays of religion of any kind in France. If you're Muslim, you're not allowed to wear a hijab in public. If you're a Jew, you're not allowed to wear a yarmulke in public. If you're a Christian, you can wear a cross, but it has to be a small one, and it has to be under your clothes. No overt religious activities are allowed in public places. Great Britain and Ireland. In Great Britain, aristocratic conservatism slowly yielded to two things: popular democracy and social welfare. The House of Commons gradually became more democratic over the 19th century. The franchise slowly expanded in 3 Reform Acts, as we know. The Reform Bill of 1832 gave the right to vote to wealthy middle-class males. And guess what? The sky didn't fall. By the way, let's use the terms Reform Bill and Reform Act interchangeably for convenience. The Reform Bill of 1867 gave the right to all middle-class males and also to the best-paid workers to vote. Sometimes politicians expanded the right to vote out of liberal ideals, and sometimes they did it to expand their own support base, and the earth still didn't come crashing down. The Reform Bill of 1884 gave the right to vote to all males. 2 things happened. The House of Lords started getting really nervous about all of this democratization starting around 1901. And they started vetoing liberal reforms that had passed in the House of Commons, especially those in support of labor unions. All of these new voters, thanks to these reforms, put the Socialist Labour Party in control of Parliament in 1906. The Labour-controlled House of Commons passed the People's Budget in 1910, and this was a massive redistribution of wealth. It consisted of increased spending on social services. The House of Lords vetoed it. King George V had just become king, and he told the House of Lords that he would pack their chamber with Labour Party members if they didn't approve the People's Budget. So they approved it. The most important Labour Party member was David Lloyd George. He was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and that position was similar to Treasury Secretary, but he could also enact financial legislation. He was responsible for all financial matters, and he famously taxed the rich. He used this revenue for national health insurance, unemployment benefits, and pensions. But what did all of this mean for Ireland? How was this democratic, welfare-oriented, progressive British state going to respond to the nationalistic desires of the Irish people? Would they finally grant Ireland home rule? Or would the Irish decide that they liked this newer, more benevolent British state? Back in 1858, the Irish Republican Brotherhood had been formed, also known as the Fenians. They were very violent, and the British had responded in kind. But as the English government became more liberal, it granted more concessions, rights for peasants, and an end to the privileges for the Anglican Church. Home rule for Ireland. William Gladstone was a liberal, pro-working class, pro-equality British politician who served as British Prime Minister 4 times. He tried twice to secure home rule for Ireland, first time in 1886, second time in 1893. Both attempts failed. Finally, in 1913, long after Gladstone's death, with the Labour Party in charge of the House of Commons, it looked like home rule was finally going to happen for Ireland. The House of Commons promised the Irish that they would have complete home rule. There was one problem. The province of Ulster, mostly Protestant, wanted to stay British. So in 1914, there were 2 different home rule bills. The House of Commons passed a bill giving the Irish nationalists the entire island. But the House of Lords approved a bill which would keep Ulster British. Before it got implemented, World War I happened, and this put everything on hold for the next 4 years. What can we conclude from all this? National feeling trumps a benevolent government. The Irish sensibilities said, we don't care how democratic you are. We don't care how progressive you are. We don't care about your social programs. You will never understand our needs because you are not Irish. And this sentiment was happening all over Europe. For example, Norway dissolved its union with Sweden in 1905. The reasons given were similar, and Sweden had very progressive policies. The Austro-Hungarian Empire of 1867. The Austrian Empire had more to lose from nationalism than anyone. Remember that the Habsburg Empire had lost a war with Prussia in 1866. It was too weak to dominate the Hungarian part of its territory. Austria and Hungary made the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, and this established Hungary as a kingdom equal to that of Austria. Francis Joseph I and his wife Elizabeth were crowned emperor and empress of this new structure in Buda on June the 8th. Austria and Hungary would be a dual monarchy. Francis Joseph I would be the emperor of both kingdoms, but they would have separate parliaments. They would have separate prime ministers. They would each deal with their own minorities, and they would share finance, war, and foreign ministries. This arrangement staggered along until 1914. Ethnic nationalism progressively weakened Austria-Hungary until it finally killed it.